Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University and the next video in our Real Biologist Reacts series to the art of Joshua Dunlop. Make sure to go show Joshua all sorts of support on all of his social links down below, including his ArtStation page, his YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. Go show him all sorts of support because obviously he's just incredible. Everything that he's done. I don't think there's been some like biological things that I've disagreed with, but there's never been a piece of art where I'm like, I don't like that. Or even like, I have mixed feelings about that. Every piece that I've seen has been like so incredibly cool and detailed. And he even posts, let me find one. He posts like some videos even about how he makes them. So if you want to sort of get into sort of 3D type art like this, these are great resources to watch as well. While you are down there clicking on all of Joshua's links, you can leave a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the video as well, and subscribe since you're already there. Today we are taking on the other set of the Generation 1 Fossil Pokemon. The first set that we, sort of talked about earlier this week was the Kabuto Line, which you can find up here in the cards. If you haven't seen that video, make sure you go watch it. But it's really interesting because I mentioned several times in that video that invertebrates are not really my forte. Especially arthropods, but there's sort of one exception to sort of the rule that I don't really know that much about invertebrates, and that is mollusks generally and cephalopods specifically. So mollusks is the group of animals that includes things like clams, snails and slugs, and so a couple of weird sort of obscure groups called polyplacophorans or polyplacophorans, and then an extinct group called monoplacophorans or monoplacophorans, and sort of most notably in the fossil record, cephalopods, which are things like squids, octopi, cuttlefish, and also ammonites. Mollusks are everywhere. Clams are probably the most common that you'll see. Bivalves probably the most common ones that you'll see in the fossil record. But we use ammonites for a lot of things in paleontology, especially figuring out where you are in time. So things like ammonites, each species has a really narrow time range, and we've sort of figured out, okay, this species is from here to here. This other species ends at the same time and goes from, here to here. So it's like if you figure out which ammonite layer you are in, you have a really good handle on, okay, where am I in time? And ammonites, well, I shouldn't say that. Not all, ammonoids have just like a plain curly shell like this. There are so many weird ones. There are some that are like in the shape of like a paperclip, which are super weird, which I think are just called heteromorph ammonoids. It's hetero something. But they're incredibly weird. There's some that have like, instead of curling over itself, they sort of curl to one side, almost like a snail shell, but they get pointy and very long. There are, if you can imagine a weird shape, other than probably like perfectly square, there's probably some kind of ammonoid that has a shell like that. But not even everything that has a curly shell like you see here, and like we'll see in Omastar, is an ammonite. So ammonite refers to a very specific subgroup of these shelled, cephalopods with shells that curl in on themselves. So throughout their evolution, they sort of started as a group called goniatites, which it's all sort of refers to how well stuck together these different sections of their shell is. So goniatites have very simple, they're called sutures, and if you remember back in the last video with Kabuto and Kabutops, I talked about sutures in reference to like the bones in your skull, how they're sort of jagged, and where one bone, because right here there's two bones, where the two bones sort of meet, it's not just like a straight line, it's like a zigzaggy line to give it more strength. And over time, they became more, jagged. The connections between each of these chambers becomes more jagged, more structurally sound. So in the beginning, they're called goniatites, and they don't have very well held together sutures. And you can't really see it. So like just because these are straight, that doesn't mean that this is like a goniatite. It's stuff that's sort of like on the inside of the shell, so you can't really see it from the outside. Then from that, they go Ceratites, I think is like the middle one, where it's like more complex, and then Ammonites are the most complex and the ones that like were around toward the end of the Ammonoid group lifespan. So Ammonoids were around for quite a while, and they went extinct obviously at, at the end of the Cretaceous period, at the same time non-avian dinosaurs did. And again, incredibly common and diverse group. The diversity of Ammonites is... I'm trying to think if there's like a comparable group today. Because like today we have some groups that are like incredibly diverse, where it's like statistically like 1 out of every 4 species on Earth is a beetle. Or at least some form of insect. So like they weren't as diverse as like insects are today. They are infinitely more diverse than like squids and octopi are today. Infinitely more diverse. Alright, so that's enough of me nerding out about Ammonites. Let's talk about Ammonite instead. So, there's actually a couple pictures of Ammonite, although they don't really show us anything different, so I'll just talk mainly in this one, and then we'll just sort of take a look at the other one. So, first of all, it looks like it's in some sort of science lab, which I think is really cool. Obviously, because it's a Pokemon, unlike Kabuto, where part of its lore is that you can find it in the wild, it's just really rare. Nothing in Ammonite's lore says that. So, it makes sense that you'd see it in a science lab because it has to be revived. And let's see. So this is definitely what cephalopod eyes look like, especially more octopod or, octopus-like eyes. Squids tend to have pupils that are more round, similar to like a human eye or like a vertebrate eye. But like octopi and cuttlefish tend to have this more weirdly shaped one. It's not completely like straight, or like straight in the way that you would see like a vertical pupil in like a cat or something. But they function in similar ways. And this is an extremely cool example of homoplazy, or as most people would probably call it, convergent evolution, where it's where 2 groups independently, so groups that are not closely related, evolve a similar feature. For example, I'm trying to think, there's many degrees of separation between mollusks and vertebrates, but certainly the common ancestor of mollusks and vertebrates did not have an eye like this. They probably had some sort of like photosensitive eye spot, but it was definitely not an eye like this or like we have, not even close. And so this is a really great example of convergent evolution, because our eyes are structured almost exactly the same, in like how it captures light, how the optic nerve sort of works. Obviously their brain is very different than a vertebrate brain, but sort of just the eyeball itself is extraordinarily similar. And obviously because of that they have excellent vision. The fact that their eyes are pointing forward typically indicates that this is a predatory animal, which I think we already kind of knew. We definitely knew that about Omastar. I don't know if that was confirmed in any of Omanite's Pokedex entries, but I don't believe it was. So Omanite's actually a little weird, in that compared to an actual Ammonite, the number of tentacles is kind of up for debate on Ammonites. I don't think we actually know, just because we very rarely get any of like the soft parts preserved. We normally just get the shell because it's hard and isn't eaten. If an Ammonite dies and sinks, there's not going to be much that's like, ooh, I'm going to eat that shell. No, they eat the soft squishy parts that they don't have to work as hard at to eat. So I don't believe we know exactly how many tentacles Ammonites had, but what we definitely do know they had is like this little flap on sort of this side of the shell, so that they could retreat their entire body into the shell, and the flap would like shut and close it. So it was sort of like a little trap door. I think it's actually called an operculum is the technical name for that. Obviously Ammonite does not have that. And it actually looks like, and even in the games, it looks like it's much more adapted to sort of like scuttling around the seafloor as opposed to swimming like you think, like an Ammonite actually would. And the similar thing with Omastar, but as we'll see, is you can probably see a little bit in Omastar's art. They are in water, so we'll actually get to see some of them in like environment. All of these little dots, like I'm sure that because they're cephalopods, I'm sure that ammonites did have some kind of suckers on sort of this side of their tentacles. How they were used, you know, whether they were more squid-like or octopus-like, because squid and octopus tentacles are very different. I don't know. I don't even know if like science has an answer to that yet. What all these little dots might be are chromatophores, and that is something that cephalopods are, you know, modern cephalopods are very well known for, is that their color changing ability, especially octopi and cuttlefish. Not as much squid, although they can still kind of do it too, but they are very, very good. Like if you've got some time to just be amazed, just like Google octopus camouflage, and it will blow your mind, because they can not only change their color, but they can change the texture of their skin to match whatever they are sitting on. And it's absolutely incredible. And then with cuttlefish, they can't do so much the skin texture thing, but they can flash colors so quickly and like with the right colors that they can actually basically give their prey a seizure and basically like disable their prey before they eat it. And it's ridiculous. It's absolutely crazy. So I could potentially see this being Ammonite having some form of defense mechanism based on chromatophores, and you can actually see sort of the ends of the tentacles look kind of reddish, which I don't think there's any precedent for in any of Ammonite's art. So it's a really curious thing that I don't know what made Joshua choose to do that, but I feel like that sort of lends a little bit of support to like a chromatophore type hypothesis there. I'm trying to think if there's really anything else to say about Ammonite. Ammonite itself is not really that interesting, just because it doesn't really have any features. You know, its tentacles don't appear to have suckers. Its shell's very plain. Its shell, actually, the way Joshua depicted it, looks a lot like coral. And to my knowledge, there aren't that many ammonites that have ornamentation on their shell like you see in Omastar, but I don't know that for sure. You know, they came in basically, their shells came in basically every shape, but as for spikes and things on it, I don't know, but we'll talk about that more once we get to Omastar. But I don't think I really have much else to say about Ammonite. Let's take a look at this other picture of Ammonite, which is it in like a tank, and you can see I'm not sure exactly what sort of like this number right here is referencing. I'm guessing it says Ammonite, experiment number, whatever. Helix fossil. And then maybe just a specimen number. That'd be really neat. You know, if they're reviving it, they've got to have a place to put it. And the fact that it is sort of on the floor of the tank does sort of give my idea of it being sort of a bottom-feeding like scuttler thing a little bit of credence, I think, but not too much. Is this the same Ammonite? It looks like it, because it's got like a cut right here and then a couple marks right here. Yeah, so this probably is supposed to be the exact same Ammonite, which is pretty neat. I'm really curious though. So obviously when you find fossils, they're almost never perfect. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a like perfect fossil. There are some, but they're extraordinarily rare. So oftentimes, especially with ammonites, you'll basically be missing this entire section of shell right here. You can find them with it, but it's generally more fragile, just because with the rest of them, they have, you know, the set of sutures here connecting that side and the sutures here. So it's just more stuff locking it in place. Whereas with this one, it only has the ones here. There's nothing on this side holding it in place, plus it's generally pretty thin. So generally this part gets broken off. But I'm really curious if these sort of cuts, because if it was just created or, you know, regenerated in captivity and then put in this tank, where would it get these scratches from. So I'm really curious to see if that would be some kind of taphonomic thing. So taphonomy is basically the study of what happens to a fossil from the moment the animal dies to when a paleontologist digs it up. So, you know, for example, a lot of the fossils that I work with were deposited by a river, and so they've been tumbled around and stuff, and you can visibly see, you know, that this was broken up by just being rolled around with the gravel in this river. So that is part of taphonomy. And so I'm curious to see if maybe this was even like a preparation mark. If you're taking the fossil out of the rock, sometimes you do damage the fossil with the tools you're using. So I'm curious that, like, if this is some kind of taphonomic mark or preparation mark that it got revived into the, you know, into Ammonite itself. I think that's really cool. Anyway, moving on to Omastar. So they actually show Omastar here with a couple Ammonite in the background. But I'm really curious. I want to know what these are. Just because we don't really have any fish fossil Pokemon, with the exception of the like fossilized fish from Galar that like the top part of Dracovish and Arctovish are from. Yeah, I don't think. Let's see. Generation 1, Generation 3, Gen 4, Gen 5, Gen 6. No, yeah, so there's that's the only fossil fish that we have. So I'm really curious what these are. These look just like generic regular fish. From distance, I almost kind of thought they looked like Remoraid. But no, they just sort of look like regular fish. Unfortunate. But, Omastar. So, these look like they are Omastar in their natural habitat, you know, millions of years ago. That's what these look like to me. And so, again, I'm not positive. It would not surprise me if there were some Ammonites with spikes like this on their shell, but I don't know of any. It's definitely something that I'm like, yeah, that could happen. But I don't know of any. One of the cool things that Omastar has, that Ammonite, I'm sure it has, but you don't get to see it, is its beak. So, and I want to make sure I get this right, at least every octopus that we are aware of is venomous. You know, most of them are not, like, medically significant to humans, but they are some form of venomous. I don't believe that squid and cuttlefish are, but I wouldn't put it past, you know, these, you know, ammonites to have been poisonous, or venomous, rather. It wouldn't surprise me, but there's almost no way to prove it. You know, from fossils, there's almost no way to prove it. And so, that'd be kind of neat. I mean, Ammonite and Omastar do get toxic spikes, I think as an egg move. And I think they get a handful of other poison-type moves, but that's not, you know, good evidence. I'm really curious just as to their swimming mechanism. Because, typically, how we think, and we're pretty confident about this, how Ammonites swam was, you know, their face is facing this way, like Omastar's is. They would have a siphon, which is just like a little hole or a little tube right here. They would suck in water. Water goes past their gills, and then they would shoot it out. I think they have another opening somewhere around their mouth. I don't think they actually shoot it out of their mouth. But some way. So they bring in water through here and expel it out this way. And so that means that their movement is this way. So they basically move backwards. And I don't see how Ammonite and Omastar do that. Which is why, like I said, I think they're probably like bottom feeders. And I really just want to address, and I think I talked about this in my fossil video that I did about Ammonite and Omastar specifically, but like, evolution does not, like one of the Pokédex entries for Omastar says that it went extinct because its shell grew too heavy, and I think that's all it says. It went extinct because its shell grew too big and heavy. That's not how evolution works. That it didn't go extinct because of that. Because what would happen is if its shell was too big, you know, there would be some individuals with shells smaller than others. And those individuals would be selected for, because if their shell was too big and they were being eaten by things, the ones with shells that were too big would be eaten, while the ones with smaller shells that could move better would not be eaten, and they would pass on their genes for having a smaller shell. That's how evolution works. And so that's just not at all how like extinction works. And so I don't know. That sort to me implies that they did swim, because if their shell was really big and heavy and they were bottom feeders, then they could just retreat into their shell, and having a big heavy shell while sitting on the bottom wouldn't hurt you. So yeah, I'm really not sure how they move. They could not have been fast. And, you know, granted, Omastar's base speed is not very high. Not that that's always the best tell of how fast a Pokemon actually is. But yeah, and I'm really curious, again, just because none of these have suckers on them. And that's something that, like, they don't have in the games. But I was curious to see if Joshua would add that, because every cephalopod that we have today, which are basically just octopi, squid, cuttlefish, and then the chambered nautilus, which is the only, like, you know, externally shelled cephalopod we have. So, like, cuttlefish do have an internal shell. It's called the cuttle bone, even though it's not really a bone. But they do have one. But the only one with an external shell is the chambered nautilus, which superficially looks a lot like an Ammonite. But they have some form of sucker on their tentacles. And I really wish that Joshua had drawn it doing some sort of action pose or doing something other than just sort of suspended in the water in the normal pose that, like, Omastar is normally in, with, like, its two tentacles up and then the two other ones sort of down, and then the smaller ones just sort of doing their own thing in the background. I wish that he had drawn it doing something else. Let's see, is there anything else I really want to talk about? Its mouth is very weird. It has obviously the 4 beak pieces, and then it looks like there's another beak inside, which I don't think is common in cephalopods. I'm trying to think. So actually, in a marine biology class that I took in undergrad, we got to dissect some, they're called boluses, from albatross, the largest flying bird that we have today. At least, like, largest wingspan bird. I don't know if it's physically the largest, but largest wingspan bird. But it's a seabird that eats mainly a lot of squid. And so the adults will eat up a bunch of squid, and they will come back to their babies and throw up into their babies' mouths, as birds do, and including squid beaks. And so, but before the babies, like, when they fledge, when they grow their flight feathers, they throw up this bolus, which is mainly full of squid beaks, because they can't really digest the squid beaks. And so, I don't believe we learned about squid having multiple sets of beaks, but that would surprise me if they did. And that's something that I don't think Joshua would just kind of add on his own. I don't even know what I'm trying to say here. Like, they don't have that many features. It's basically just the shell, and then blue tentacles, some eyes, and in Omastar's case, a mouth. They're very nondescript. Yeah, so I don't really have much else to say about them. Alright, so that's going to wrap up this video. Once again, thank you to Joshua for allowing me to make content based on your art. It really means a lot, because obviously he doesn't have to let creators do that. But yeah, so go show Joshua all sorts of support. Support any kind of artist that you can in these times. I elaborate a little bit more in the last video. But, like, a lot of, like, freelancers, artists, those kinds of creative type people who don't... and granted, I don't know Joshua. I don't know if he has, like, a 9-to-5 job. But people who are, like, in the creative space and, like, doing freelance type work are really, really struggling these days with COVID and everything. So any way you can support those sorts of people doing those sorts of jobs, that goes a really long way. Make sure to follow me on Twitter as well, at Pallet_you, to keep up on all things Pokemon science, as well as if you feel like our content is worthy of supporting financially as well, we do have a Patreon link, which will be down in the description. Thank you, as always, to our supporters over on Patreon, Patty Murphy. Thank you. And lastly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, there's a time and place for everything.